Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Nothing to announce or anything, so let's just jump right into the questions. First up, over on floatplane, Retroshawn said they've been seeing the new RetroTINK 5X in action, and they want to know how does it do scaling up 480p games like Wii and GameCube? How does it compare for Wii versus the Wii U's HDMI upscale? I have a 2012 Samsung Plasma TV, and I find it doesn't do a great job with 480p. That's interesting, because I had a Panasonic Plasma that did amazing with 480p, but I guess it's hit or miss. It's the scaler that's built in. What you're getting through the RetroTINK 5X on a 1080p panel, which I'm assuming that's what your Samsung would be, but if that's the case, what you're probably going to end up using is the 1080p fill mode, which stretches it to the vertical height of the screen. And at the very least, it should do a better job than what's built into your TV. Even if you had a good scaler built in there, it should do a better job with that. You could try the other modes just to see, 480p pass-through, but overscanned 720p's, which unless your panel is 720, I wouldn't suggest that at all. And then, of course, just the main 1080p modes. If you do the 1080p under the 960p mode, you'll get a pretty sharp image, but you'll have black bars in the top and bottom. So it really depends on the look that you're going for. Now, if you had a modern 4K TV, something that came out in the past 2 years, I would say it would be a big difference because you could do something like scale to 1440p and let your panel do the rest of the scaling to 4K. And that's probably going to look awesome. I only was able to test that on one panel, a CX OLED, and it just looked nuts. It looked like a PS3 or Xbox 360 game being rendered in a higher resolution. Now, anybody with an eagle eye could tell it's a scale, not a render, but the overall feel, I think that's just kind of a good way to describe it. So, for your current setup, I don't know. I'm not sure if you would notice a giant difference, but if you were planning on upgrading at some point anyway, it's something to think about. The importer wants to know why I don't call my floatplane channel RetroRGB. That's kind of a weird, interesting thing in that I've been struggling for the past few years on how exactly to represent myself and what's the best for the website overall. Because my opinion on this from the beginning has always been I'm Bob from RetroRGB. I don't ever introduce myself as RetroRGB because the site has always been about celebrating everybody else in the retro gaming scene. So even at first, when I was mostly just concentrating on guides and links to stuff, even the guides that I wrote myself based on research that I totally did myself would have never been able to happen without the help of everybody else in the retro gaming community. So even back then, I wanted it to be something that everybody felt was bigger than one person. And then, of course, as soon as I started the podcast and doing interviews, that was a very literal gesture of showing everybody how appreciative I am of everybody in the scene and how I want to just share everybody with the rest of the world. So it's kind of been mostly a positive thing in that, I just want to make sure that the website's celebrated as a collaboration. Even people that just text me stuff like, hey, have you seen this? I think people would like it. And, I wouldn't have seen that if it wasn't for them. Even though I wrote the article and talked about it, it didn't come from me. So I really want to celebrate all of that stuff. But on the other side, it's kind of hard to try to build a following when you separate yourself from something that is a big part of everything that you do. So I had plans over the past few years, at 2 solid times where I even had a date picked and everything, where I was going to switch everything over to a different name, my full name, something. I couldn't think of one. I'm terrible at thinking of names. The band I was in last wrote like 15 songs, and we got lyrics, the songs were done, and we only had names for like 2 of them and not even a band name. Like, I'm terrible at naming stuff. So, I was going to pick one of those and then switch everything over and just try to make it a public thing that I am not RetroRGB. I'm just, the founder and the main contributor at the moment, with a whole bunch of amazing people contributing with me from anything other than submitting full articles like you see, or just, little pieces of the site. But I just don't know what the right move is. And all I really care about is what's best for the site overall. There's no ego involved in this. I'd call myself, pile of steaming dog poop if I thought it would make me, it would help promote everything better and make everybody that works with me look good. So, it's not about that at all. It's just about I'm trying to figure out the best way to do it. At the time that I signed up for floatplane was right before one of those big switches were going to happen. And then just giant life things has stopped and got in the way. One of them, of course, being the pandemic, where I was like, I don't know what anybody's going to be doing in the next 3 to 6 months. So let me just stay exactly as I am and hope for the best. So I guess I'm kind of wimping out a little bit, but I just want to do the right thing for everybody without losing everything that I've built so far. So hopefully that came out right. Very often when I talk about this stuff, I listen back to what I said and I'm like, ew, gross. I sound unappreciative and, and greedy or something. And it's not at all as I'm intending it to be. I just wanted to give an honest answer to your question, to explain a little bit why there's some separation and not others. And if anybody has any thoughts on this, I'm all ears, but every time I talk to smart people who are in the scene, in YouTube, they understand algorithms, everybody kind of has a completely different suggestion for me. And I just don't really know what the best advice is to take. So I am completely open to anything whatsoever. I just want it to be the right move for the website as a whole, as well as the contributors and the retro gaming scene. And I don't want to lose everything I built. So, I'm all open to any suggestions, but that's kind of where I'm at now. And hopefully I'll figure something out relatively soon. Another one from the importer, they wanted to know what the difference is between the Sega Saturn component cables from retrogamingcables.co.uk versus the HD Retrovision Genesis cables through a Saturn adapter. I've never actually tested them. I have them here. I think Rob sent them to me a long time ago, and I just keep forgetting to do any tests. But the big difference is all of the converters inside of those retro gaming cables are a generic circuit that's pretty much the same as what's in the RGB to comp, the RetroTINK device, which anybody that's used that knows it produces a really, really good signal. Now, the HD Retrovisions, on the other hand, are fine-tuned for each console, and those console adapters, like Genesis to Saturn, they're not just pass-through adapters. They include little circuitry in there to make sure that everything matches up, so they really are perfectly designed for everything they're plugged into. So I think, based on everything I've seen with the RGB to comp, there's two answers to that question. If you're playing on a CRT, whether it's a PVM or a consumer-grade TV that only accepts 480i through Component, whatever, I don't think you'll ever notice a difference between either of those. I think they're both excellent solutions, and I think they're perfectly good for that use. However, if you're taking that signal, scaling it through something like the open source scan converter, especially if you took the time to do optimal timings or the RetroTINK 5X or anything like that, and then you're scaling it to 4K, you might notice a tiny, tiny bit of difference. But even then, I don't know if it's going to be noticeable. I think it would have to be the type of thing like I show in my reviews where, here it is side by side and it looks identical. And now here it is zoomed in 20,000 times so you can see each pixel on Link's face. And then you might see a difference then. But I honestly don't know if you would even see a difference in that scenario. So my general recommendation is if you're doing a full setup where you're just looking for everything tweaked and as best as possible, going through all the scalers, just try to get the best cables you can. The shieldings, is excellent on the HD Retrovisions. That alone might make a difference. If you have a well-shielded cable versus a really, really well-shielded cable, that might be a small difference because it's going down, 6 feet of cable, stuff like that. I mean, if you're really pushing for squeezing every little percentage of quality out, I would always just get the best of everything. But if you're just looking for excellent, I want to make sure I'm clear about this. I'm setting the bar at excellent, not anything below that. I can't imagine those cables would be anything other than great and you would be happy with them. It's just the little tiny tweaks between generic conversion versus specific to each console may or may not come out when you start scaling into a 70-inch 4K TV, but on a CRT it should be the same. Now, once again, I'm only speculating. They're here in the box right next to me, and I haven't had a chance to put them through. If Rob did something like use crappy unshielded cables, which he's not doing that, I'm just saying hypothetically, then yeah, you'd probably notice a difference. But Rob uses shielded cables, so I can't imagine there'd be a huge difference. But hopefully that kind of adds some perspective on all of it, and I think you should be happy with both, to be honest. Over on the YouTube subscription service, Scotter140 said they figured out where a lot of their confusion came from in regards to the questions from the past week or two, I believe. And they said the SCART connection on their open source scan converter kept getting half unplugged, so the colors would get messed up. Silly mistake, happens to me all the time, or when I'm using older SCART cables and a color drops out and I just kind of wiggle the SCART end a little bit, make sure I push the cable in and it starts working again. I beat up my cables pretty bad though. I don't just leave them plugged in and walk away. I'm constantly plugging and unplugging and testing stuff. So yeah, it's a fun, silly mistake, but it's really great when that's the only problem. So, but they just wanted to clarify something. They should be able to have all of their consoles connected with SCART and then output either SCART, Component, or Composite, and that's the mistake. You cannot put Composite video into the open source scan converter. You can put RGB and Component through a SCART head into the OSSC. You just have to toggle the different inputs for it. But you cannot put Composite directly in. You need a Coryu or an original one of the RetroTINKs in pass-through mode. I guess you could do 480p mode too, but if you have a RetroTINK, just use it in pass-through mode. And the later model RetroTINKs, you could even take advantage of their really good comb filter. So at that point, it's really, do you want to upgrade to the RetroTINK 5X? Do you want to try to pick up a used Pro or M, or I guess even the Mini, and set those to pass-through mode? It's totally up to you what you decide for that stuff, but yeah, you just can't go Composite directly into the open source scan converter. Over on Patreon now, I just wanted to address everybody who commented about the timestamps. It seems like overwhelmingly everybody liked them, so I'm going to keep trying it. I'm going to give it my best, and as long as it doesn't drive me crazy, I will definitely do that. As these Q&As start to get longer and longer as more people join, we might have to figure out another plan of sorts, but for now I'm going to keep it going. So thank you all very much for your feedback on this. It seems like it's worth the effort, and I really appreciate all the kind words and everything. Thank you. Schurzor Steinholm, I think I got your first name right, but it's going to take me a while to get the correct pronunciation of that last name, but I'm giving it effort. But Schurzor has a question regarding the RetroTINK 5X. They currently have a FrameMeister, mainly for their composite sources, and an open source scan converter for Component and RGB. I don't see it mentioned anywhere if the RetroTINK 5X supports Component through SCART like the OSSC does. Is this possible, or could it be a possible feature in the future? No. The only formats that will ever be supported on the TINK 5X through the SCART port are SCART and Composite. And Composite's really just a bonus because you could pull that right off the sync line for many cables anyway, so you don't need anything customized or anything like that. Now, we are working on an adapter. Actually, I'll show you a sneak peek here because I love all of you. But the VGA to SCART adapter is working. I hand soldered this myself. They will not be this ugly in production. So there will be a VGA adapter that plugs in the side of the RetroTINK that works in both RGBS pass-through as well as RGB HV and handles sync voltage. So if you're using the Mister or a Supergun or any device that outputs TTL sync from a D-sub connector, you have nothing to worry about. I'm very excited about this. I know it's weird because I get to work with some of the most brilliant developers on the planet, and stuff like this tiny little device gets me so excited just because even though it's silly and not everybody needs it, I think everybody that does want to use this type of thing is going to go nuts when they see the compatibility and how easy it is to do all of this stuff. I think it just solves a ton of problems for a lot of people's setups. So no. To complete your question, if so, then it could make my setup way cleaner, only having one SCART cable going from the G-SCART to a RetroTINK 5X, carrying all of those through the same cable. I totally agree with you there, but there's certainly ups and downs to all of this stuff, and I think if you wanted to go through that, you could just use a couple of G-SCART and G-comp switches and have them all kind of set up in a way where all you would have to do is change the input of the RetroTINK 5X and kind of go from there. But I mean, you did mention having a FrameMeister and an OSSC, so you have a great setup already. If you just wanted to get rid of those in order to simplify things and only have one processor, that I completely and totally understand. But if you were looking for a performance boost of any kind, I mean, I think what you have is pretty awesome. I think the only thing that would push me if I were in your situation are the downscaling capabilities or fast resolution switching. But if you don't use either of those, then I would just keep what you have because they're both great devices. Just my opinions, though. Do whatever you like. If you're crazy like me, you'll probably get this too and have all three on hand just to use them. The next question is from somebody who was very frustrated with all of the part shortages and products that have been selling out quickly, and asked what I would say to someone thinking of leaving the retro gaming community because of this. I would say that that's a level of entitlement that I can't even begin to speak to, and this is probably not the channel for you to be subscribing to. I'm pretty positive everybody who asks me questions wants my real answer, not some softened fluff that makes you feel better, so I'm not pulling any punches, but I also don't know if you're being silly or sarcastic, or if that's just a facetious comment from a frustrated gamer who loves this stuff and is just throwing their hands up in the air going, what do I do next? So I covered their name. I also covered the response just because I don't want anybody to think the person who responded is the person who asked the question. I don't want to mock anybody or shame anybody, but I do want to address the question as if it were coming from somebody who's just being silly asking it that way, which is totally fine. And the reason that all of this stuff is happening is multi-layered. So before, pre-pandemic, if you have all of these pretty much small companies funded by one or two people making products, it's really, really hard to get everything right. My previous job, I did a bunch of things, IT, nerd related, but my favorite job that I had before RetroRGB was a company that manufactured and designed medical grade computers. It was a small company, so while I wasn't the person in charge of procuring parts and all of that stuff, it definitely fell on my lap a bunch of times. And I could tell you right now, in a regular climate, just being able to go to a company and say, hey, I have 100 or 500 or 1,000 of something that I would like to make. Can you make it for me? It's rough because you first are competing with companies that are putting in orders for 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. So companies are more likely to take their orders because it's just way more beneficial for them. On top of that, I have personally had the experience many times of companies doing things like swapping parts in production. There was one devastating one where we got power supplies, everything tested fine. We spent like a week beating the heck out of them, put in the order for 5,000. And all of a sudden, we're getting failures in the field, and I go out to test it, and the power supplies are different. They swapped components out of it to save money. They said that wasn't it, but it was definitely it. They were skimming off the top. So there's stuff like this. And now, also remember that these are mostly being funded by people directly. And there's already been a case in retro gaming, at least one, where somebody made something through a contract manufacturer. Batch 1 was mostly fine, couple issues, but whatever. Batch number 2 was totally fine, everybody's happy. Batch number 3 gets together, it's a bigger batch, they paid the manufacturer goes out of business and disappears. So at that point, you either lose all of your own money, or all of the money that people paid you. It's a nightmare scenario. It's the worst thing that could happen, and it's not uncommon. It doesn't happen every time, but it's something that you have to think about. So in a normal area, or a normal climate, normal time period, for somebody to go out and say, I think I'll sell 1,000, but maybe I'll make 3,000. That could be devastating. That could destroy somebody's life, because you could just be out every penny you have with no means to make any more money. Now, on top of all of that, if you add the global pandemic to this, as well as the part shortages, you have all of those other problems. You're competing with all of these other companies, and you're also competing against, hey, this company needs to buy 100,000 of these, and you just need to buy 1,000. There's no parts left over for you. You have to switch to a different part number and redesign your product. And that's what happens a lot, especially in the past 3 to 6 months time. And that's why a lot of people who are doing pre-orders, you'll hear them say, batch 1 is kind of small, but batch 2 is coming really soon. It's because they bought batch 1 with all of the parts available, had to redesign the product so that different parts would physically fit, or whatever else, retest the whole product, the full QA process, and then have another batch made with the alternative parts that are equally as good, just different. Going to move your pads over, going to make sure there's no other things going on. So of all the time periods to be upset about this is the one where you shouldn't. You should just take a deep breath and go, sucks for everybody, but it's definitely nobody's fault this time. There is one company that I'm pretty positive intentionally makes just too few for everybody so they get the notoriety, but that's not the norm at all. So if your question was worded in a silly way, I hope I took the time to answer it properly, and I hope other people appreciated it. If you were dead serious, though, about your comment, then maybe the answer is yes, you should leave because this isn't for you. These are small companies working so tremendously hard to get these products out to people. And if my comments offended anybody, you could go on Twitter and join the group of hate tweets against me that everybody else seems to enjoy sometimes. But it's the truth, whether you like it or not. So I apologize for my harshness, but once again, I'm always going to be me. I'm not going to be, a different version that somebody might want me to be. Rick Lewis wants some clarification on splitters and switches and stuff like that. Rick said composite is an analog signal, so therefore you could buy cheap switches because it's just passing the signal through, adding no interference or lag. Not quite. So any analog device, when you add something in the middle of it, will absolutely reduce the quality. Now, very good quality devices, like putting a composite signal through the gcomp switch, it's not anything noticeable by the human eye. You would have to zoom in like 20,000 times to start to see signal degradation. But a really cheap piece of crap switch, yeah, even with composite, you could totally notice the difference. So you're correct in saying that you don't have to worry about lag with most analog switches and splitters and stuff like that. But interference is definitely always a number one concern when you're talking about analog video signals. It's the same for a splitter. I've seen video distribution amps. So basically, remember Circuit City back in the day, they had a wall of TVs all connected through composite or something. So you'd put one composite input, and then it would go out to 12 different ones that's meant to go across 500, 1,000 feet across the store. That type of stuff was meant for distribution and splitting. It wasn't really meant for just, I want to take two displays and have my signal displayed on both. So you could absolutely see a signal drop or way too bright or something if it was designed for long runs. But on the other side of things, if you use something that's designed for gaming, it's like, I'm just going to call out the gcomp switch again because it's, I think, one of the only ones I know that actually has a composite video port in it, but there's others. Then you wouldn't have to worry about that because it's designed to split to two different displays that are within a reasonable distance of the switch. So once again, too, you can't use a Y cable with composite video because that would put too much load on the source device. So you absolutely would need an official splitter, something that has a circuit that digitally splits it into two. So the question is, can I recommend a no-lag composite 1-in and 2-out splitter? But I wanted to know generically how it works. So I think I kind of covered how it all works. My recommendation is if you're integrating it into a retro gaming setup and you also have component video cables, then try out the gcomp switch. It has auto switching too. If you're looking for a budget device, you could try to look for any 1-in, 2-out powered composite video switch. If it's not powered, then you're probably only allowed to use one output at a time and not even leave anything plugged in. I don't even know why. I've seen those before, and I don't even know why they're allowed on the market. They never really worked right. So I think maybe the context in which I'd seen them, where there were two outputs, one and you would choose one for composite and one for S video, so you wouldn't actually be populating the two composite outputs at the same time. So just don't Y cable it, whether it's metaphorically through the box or literally. Just make sure it's a powered composite video splitter. You might be able to use a component video splitter that's component in and component out, and then you just run composite through the green jack and see what happens. But basically, if you're just looking to experiment, I would try a powered device. That's the cheapest you could find on eBay. Or if you really wanted to integrate this in your setup, save up, spend the money, and get stuff that's designed exactly for this, like the gcomp. Watermelon Bonsai wanted to talk about their HD CRT that supports HDMI input. I'm not reading the whole question just out of respect for everybody else's time, but it's a great question in that they've experimented with it and they found that it can do 480i, 480p, and 1080i perfectly, and they currently use it with their GameCube running 480p. And they wanted to know if they could use other HDMI mods with such a connection like the DC Digital. And the answer is yes, and I am planning exactly this. I think I might even have the exact same model HD CRT in my storage area waiting for me, but I plan on using that with its HDMI input to run Dreamcast, GameCube, Wii with a Wii Dual in it, and pretty much anything else that could output 480p PlayStation 3 via HDMI. I'll probably use my RetroTINK 2XM in pass-through mode to pass the PlayStation 2 through, so I won't be deinterlacing it, I'll just be playing 480i, but I'll still get the advantage of the oversampling and supporting all the resolutions. I probably could just plug it in the component video input, but what I did definitely find with mine, and it might be capacitors, it might be my individual unit, but when I plugged the Time Sleuth into the HDMI port, it looked crystal clear. When I plugged the Time Sleuth into the component video jack through a converter, a good converter, it looked really fuzzy. So maybe I need to recap the conversion board, but going in HDMI looked amazing. By the way, it was my model, I can't remember the exact model number, I think it's yours, 0 lag on 480i, 480p, and 1080i. That's confirmed through both the HDMI and component video input, but it did treat 240p as 480i, so I wouldn't go any lower on it. Mine is a widescreen, so I think it's perfect for the consoles I just mentioned. But yeah, that's my setup. Hopefully, if I'm able to get a house with a basement, would be PVMs and BVMs in the middle on a big metal rack like I used to have in my old office. And then the two corners, one square 15 kilohertz only TV with all of those consoles, and then this widescreen HD CRT with, once again, Wii, GameCube, PS2 through the RetroTINK 2XM, Dreamcast, and maybe and PlayStation 3, and maybe one or two others, maybe even Wii U, going into that in 480p. So I basically have two of the dream setups there, and then if I want to put something on a fancy BVM, I could just pull out the console and move it in the middle. I'm really hoping to find a place soon, get out of the city. I freaking love New York City, but it's just, I can't. I mean, anybody that saw my live stream the other day, I am working on, you know what? I got a measuring tape right here. The only space I had to do that entire live stream was 2 feet 6 inches by 1 foot 10 inches. That was my entire workspace to try to test all of that stuff through a scope with a CRT. It's brutal trying to work in such a small space. So I would just love a big unfinished basement. I could decorate nice. I could kind of make it look presentable, and then have all of these setups and a bunch of just folding tables along the wall, just so I could work on projects and just grab a laptop and a webcam, be able to do live streams and spread out on a big spot. I think that's kind of the dream. So sorry for completely going off topic on your question and fantasizing about something that may or may not happen, but I heard your idea and it reminded me of my idea, and I just wanted to share it with people. So if you have a bunch of extra space in a basement somewhere and you want to set up stuff like that, you could bet that if I pull this off, I'm going to be doing a video showing all of these things just for fun. I don't even care if 3 people watch it. I think the 3 people that do would probably be like, oh, awesome, I want a weird HD CRT too that I'll probably never use because I'm using the other one, but I like that I have it anyway. So cool question, and yeah, that's an awesome setup. Blue Rigel 81 wants to know if I foresee an optical drive emulator becoming available for the PS1, the slim one, the little white PlayStation 1 model. And no, I don't see that in the near future, just because of the way that the information's passed. It would take somebody doing a lot of work to make that happen. And alternatively, you can get mod chips for like $5 that you could install in one of those and play CDRs on it. So my guess, I could be wrong. I don't have any insider info. Somebody could be working on this right now for all I know. But my suggestion would be, if you really are looking to do an optical drive emulator for your PlayStation 1, grab an X-Station, grab a compatible model, and either keep your original one, your PS1, as an unmodded original, I'll use that for discs type of thing, or even sell it on eBay. And I kind of was going through the same thing when I got my X-Station installed, because I had a couple original PlayStation 1 models that weren't compatible, so I need to get around to digging those out, cleaning them up, selling them, and I want exactly that, a PS1, one of the small ones. I just sold mine like a year and a half ago too, stupidly, but I figure I'll have an all-stock PlayStation being the small one, and then the ODE HDMI one will be my main one that I actually use. But remember too that I'm not so much a collector as I am a tester. So if you're a PlayStation collector, that's a good move. If you're a content creator that constantly needs to do comparison, that's a good move. But if you're just somebody who loves the PlayStation 1, just I would just sell yours and pick up the compatible model and install the ODE. And I think there's something coming out I've seen on Twitter, so I'm not spilling the beans, but that allows you to keep the optical drive on your PlayStation 1 and install the X-Station. I haven't tested it personally yet, but there's no further info, so you don't have to even worry about Googling it. The moment that becomes available, I will be doing a video and a post and all that stuff if it becomes available. So hopefully that'll kind of point you in the right direction. Chris Fratz wanted to chime in with some ideas and thoughts on using a PC on an OLED TV. Just some basic tips, which I probably forgot to mention, but if you did want to do that, set your taskbar or dock to always auto hide, make sure there's no desktop icons at all, and then get one of those wallpaper engines. You can get them on Steam. You can get free ones that constantly cycle through your wallpaper every couple of minutes, and that should drastically reduce any chance of burn-in. But if you're like me and you leave your Chrome window open all the time or something like that, then that's always a risk. So great tips. Should have mentioned that. Also, he said a bunch of PC games do have support for surround sound or accelerated audio. You just have to look up each one individually, including even some older ones that were pre-HD era. Really, I guess computers would always have been 480p since the 90s, but hopefully you know what I mean. So yeah, thanks for chiming in, Chris. Appreciate it. Nathan Hardy said they like the sharpness of Component in RGB, but have a good number of games that use dithering or transparency heavily that would benefit from Composite on a CRT. So they were looking for easy ways to accomplish this without swapping cables back and forth. So unfortunately, that is going to be the easiest and cheapest way by far, but I'd like to go over the methods just for people to understand. So in a perfect world, what you would have is all of your consoles connected to RGB or Component, and you go through a switch with two outputs. So let's just say all RGB SCART into a G-SCART switch. One output going to your monitor's RGB input, the other output going to a converter that converts to Composite. But that can't be done with video games, at least with the chips that are available to us now, because all of those chips are designed to convert video signals. So if you were to maybe use a PlayStation 2 outputting 480i, that might work, because I think that's mostly a basic TV signal. There might be some games that work and some don't, but all 240p and all consoles that go through that, the composite video output is going to have really messed up colors. And I've tested 5 or 6 different converters now, and it's always the same. They work fine for TV signals, but not for video games. So because that's not an option, what are your other choices then? Well, believe it or not, one very inexpensive way to get around this is have your full RGB setup, buy cheap composite cables for all of these, and then just buy a cheap composite switch. Just a manual push button switch that has composite and left and right audio in it. And you would then have to switch the input on your TV, switch the input on the composite switch, and then swap the cable in back of your console. So that is not at all the ideal situation. However, it is certainly the cheapest by far. It might even, in fact, be cheaper than picking up a converter, even if those converters did exist. Now, the much better solution that would only work on some consoles and not others would be to have a breakout device that plugs into the AV port, and breaks out whatever signals are available. And on consoles like the Genesis, which uses a Sony CXA encoder, you could totally and safely use composite and RGB at the exact same time, no problem. But there are some models of the Super Nintendo that I know are safe and have a similar chip, and there are other models of the Super Nintendo that I don't know are safe at all. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but one of the main reasons one of these devices doesn't exist yet, or they're only hobby do-it-yourselfer type things, is because of that. You don't want to sell a product that you could take 2 consoles that look identical on the outside and it works fine on one and could possibly kill the other. So there would have to be a lot of research as to what exactly they could be used on simultaneously. And the other side too is making cables is really, really hard. I think most people think that they know, but they don't quite understand how hard it is to make a really good shielded cable. So in order to make something like this and produce it in high quantities obviously in order to get the price down, would be really hard. You'd either have to sacrifice price or quality, and no one's going to spend $100 on a breakout adapter, and no one's going to want to buy a $20 breakout adapter that barely works and gets all the interference. So while we've been working on something like this for a long time now, we've been bouncing back different ideas. We had some really crazy ideas that we thought might solve it. But at the moment, I think what's going to happen is within a few months, we're just going to release it as an open source design. Just putting it out there that if you want to make your own, you can. It's really tedious to add the cable section to it and use it at your own risk. If you know that you're using it on a console with a proper encoder, cool. If not, it's on you. It's 100% do it yourself, no warranty, open source, freeware type of thing. But if it does work, I think the setup that I fantasized about before, over on the side that had the 4x3 15 kilohertz RGB modded consumer TV, I would love to do something like add those to all my consoles, use shielded RCA cables, so probably just HD Retrovision pass-throughs, and connect RGB and composite video using RCA cables into a gcomp switch. So essentially RGB sync using composite video as sync. And remember, if everything's shielded and you're using good quality devices, there's no interference with composite video. It's only if they're not shielded and separated enough. So I would love to put that into a gcomp switch and then use two of the outputs, RGB-S going into the RGB input of the TV, and on the second output, because remember, you can't Y cable this any video signals, only audio, but on the second powered output, I would take composite video and left and right audio, and then I would be able to, in real time, press an input button and switch between RGB and composite, all using the same automated setup with no cable swapping whatsoever. The only thing you would have to decide is what input to use on the TV. So that's the dream scenario. When we finish up this product and we get it open sourced, you better believe I'm going to do a video on it because I love weird adapters and stuff like this. It's probably going to end up being a tedious thing that people have to build themselves, but whatever. I'd rather have it out there than not. And who knows, maybe we'll find some weird fun trick to get them manufactured cheap and still good quality. No clue, but I'll keep everybody posted as soon as there's any word on that at all. The Remora wanted to know what's the best output from a PlayStation 2. Component video using the HD Retrovision shielded cables, not the converters, just the pass-through ones, or a really good RGB SCART cable with Sync on Luma. And I did discuss this in detail with Mike Chi on the live stream that we did, but I wanted to answer it anyway because it's a very common question, and I had gotten the answer wrong for a long time. Many years ago, probably long before the podcast even started, but it's still a mistake that I want to apologize about and make sure that I make the efforts to correct. But essentially, there's mostly no difference. Mike actually said that he found that the component video output of the PlayStation 2, it can be sharper than its RGB output. And Mike's done a lot of analysis on this. In my testing, they were identical except for one thing. If you use crappy component video cables, you end up really severely damaging the image. And that's what was happening is I was picking up third-party cables that were big and heavy and looked shielded, and I was doing these comparisons going, no, component video sucks out of a PlayStation 2. Let's all switch to this instead. But after somebody told me, like, hey, you definitely got that wrong, cut open your cables, I did, and they weren't shielded. They were just the same scam that a lot of these cables do, in that it looks big and heavy and shielded, but it's just foam. It's not, there's no actual shielding on the conductors, and the conductors were tiny on the inside. So, I corrected that. Once the HD Retrovisions were released, I tested with those. So the only time I would ever recommend using RGB SCART for PlayStation 2 with Sync on Luma, and then of course Sync on Green for 480p stuff, that's only good if you already have a full RGB setup. So let's say all of your consoles are RGB SCART, you're going into a modern gcomp switch or any other switch, and you're also going into an open source scan converter. Everything will work perfect in 240p and 480i mode. When you hit 480p, your PlayStation 2 switches to syncing on the green line, and then in that case, you're able to just switch the input on your open source scan converter or your Sony BVM if it's a multi-sync or something like that, and you'll be able to sync right off of the green line, and now you don't have to change anything in your setup to get from 480i to 480p. But if you have a mixed setup, or if you don't mind, having different inputs or connections, there is no pressing of the button with component. You plug the cable in, it outputs all resolutions. It's compatible with everything that's compatible with 480i and 480p. And according to Mike, it may in some cases actually end up being sharper anyway. So I usually now recommend, unless you have a full RGB SCART setup and the only console that's not RGB is your PlayStation 2, I would always recommend just buying the HD Retrovision cables and using component video instead of that. But, once again, there's nothing wrong with doing the sync on Luma cable with, sync on green for 480p, but it gets confusing and weird. And even Modern Vintage Gamer, that was the issue that he talked about in his RetroTINK 5X video, and I don't think he remembered that was a sync on green thing. So even experts can get tripped up on that. I'm not throwing shade at MVG. Obviously, I'm a fan, but just saying it's something that could be confusing to everybody. So just go component unless you absolutely have to, just because it's much easier. Marcello Medini wanted to know if they took a PAL CDI 220 and did the region mod switch, would that prevent the SCART connector from working? I don't think so. I've never done it, but there's actually a great guide for region modding CDIs. I'll link to it here. I'm 99% sure everything would be fine. It would just change the region. So their thought was to transcode the RGB to component video and then use it on their Trinitron consumer CRT instead of running it to a PVM. Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I would also add is if you're using any FMV games like Thunder in Paradise, Composite actually looks pretty good because it blends all of it together, because that's actually 240p encoded video. That's not even 480i video, so it's very blocky. So Composite really does hide that. But I totally get what you're going for, and I'm 99% sure it'd work fine, and I will put a link to the region modding for those CDIs in case you're interested. Also, thanks very much for the kind words. Jose Alvarado said they recently got a good deal on a 30-inch Panasonic CRT with all the good inputs, component, composite, S-video, and they want to hook all of their retro consoles up to it. They recently pre-ordered 2 of the gcomp 8x2 switches, and they're planning on getting the HD Retrovision cables, but they have a few questions. They would like to daisy chain those gcomp switches, and they're not sure how. Do I use the spare output port to connect to the second one? Yes, exactly. That's all you need. Just put the output of one into the next input of the other. Make sure to use really good shielded cables for that, because if you use just cheap junky cables, you could take all of that awesome shielded perfect switch and then just destroy all of it with bad cables. So, even just another set of HD Retrovisions, if you want to separate them, is fine. It's kind of a long cable for that. You could also just go to Amazon and pick up a short 1-footer and just test it out and see. If it looks good and there's no interference, it's a win. Second question, they read the frequently asked questions on the HD Retrovision site for 240p over component, ran the tests that they recommend for each of the consoles, and most of them passed, except for their Super Nintendo 2-chip older model. There's a weird flickering on the top of the screen, and I was wondering if there's an RGB bypass mod out for it. If not, would it be better to get a SNES Junior and mod it? So if you have a Panasonic CRT, unless it's an HD CRT, that that test that you ran doesn't matter. And I mean that respectfully. It just, I think what you're seeing is specifically the kind of the interference of a 2-chip Super Nintendo, or there could be something wrong with that particular one. But if it's just a basic 480i only, or in 240p of course, but a 15 kilohertz CRT, you don't need to worry about those HD Retrovision tests. That's if you're going directly into the component video inputs of a flat panel, and even that way, they're still not, still not the best method, just because most panels I've tested add lag through their analog inputs, not through their HDMI. So you'd pretty much always want to use a converter. So my suggestion would be to either wait for an upcoming mod for the 2-chip Super Nintendo, which could be out next month, it could be 6 months, with part shortages and so much, especially on my plate, I don't know if I'm going to get to testing soon. Or you could pick up a SNES Junior now, mod it yourself. It's fairly easy. You need to be patient. Definitely watch the videos and read the tutorials out there, unless you've already modded consoles, and then you already know it's easy. But if you're a big fan of the Super Nintendo, I would pick up a Junior anyway. If you could find one for a decent price, you get you get a really good signal quality out of it, and then hold on to your older one to see what new mods come out for that in the next year or two, and then kind of see where you're at with it. I always hesitate when I tell people just go out and buy stuff, as if money doesn't matter, but I feel like if you're asking the question, you've already decided that you're going to probably invest a little bit into your setup. So I would pick up a Junior, just kind of use that one now and either keep 2, or when the new mods come out, decide which one you're going to want to sell. Mark Main said that they have all of their consoles running through a G-SCART switch into a LinuxBot 3000 RGB to S-video converter. And their picture on their PVM, which is a model that only accepts up to S-video, no RGB input, but the picture on their PVM is a little yellow or greenish. Is there a setting I need to change? So I would recommend, if you have any composite or S-video cables laying around for any of these consoles, I would try plugging directly in first, and just to compare and see. Your capacitors could be aging, the calibration could be off, and for stuff like color tint, if you're just talking about the knobs on the front, I would be completely okay with just messing around with those until the color looks close enough. And then if you ever go to refurbish the CRT, recap it, and calibrate it and stuff like that, yeah, it'll probably be off, but you're talking about the knobs in the front, not deep service manual settings and stuff like that. So I would just give that a try and see. Always good to do apples to apples comparisons. So if you have like a Super Nintendo with an S-video cable that you could go direct in, put up a color bar or something, take a look, and then plug it back in through that converter setup and see. If the tint is off, just mess with it on your TV and deal with it. Or even if it's not, I mean, it might just be fine to mess with it on the TV itself. And if you still have some weird color issues, I would just make sure that it happens through all consoles. And if it doesn't, it could be a console specific thing, but I kind of would just start doing the troubleshooting steps of, trying to figure out exactly where it's coming from. And it could be the converter itself. Maybe you should contact LinuxBot to see if they've seen this before as well. But before you do that, I would just kind of step through typical troubleshooting and see if you could pinpoint it. A couple of questions from Alan Bingham. First, they have an analog NT Mini Noir with a jailbreak firmware installed, and they want to know if there's any advantage to also using an Everdrive N8. And my opinion's no, because I'm pretty sure the NT Mini supports all the mappers from all the games. The only thing would be if you want to take games between original hardware and that. So if you use that on your flat panel, but you also have an original one hooked up to a composite video CRT, and you play games like Zelda with save games, you might want to just be able to move them between the two. But other than that, no, I don't think there's any reason. And if I'm forgetting anything, please somebody chime in. The next question is a bit longer, so I'm respectfully not going to read through it all, but I'll obviously always be happy to answer this stuff. The question's basically, they always really loved original hardware, the cartridges themselves, the original consoles, but now with ROM carts and ODEs and stuff like that, they found themselves using those more often. And now with FPGA stuff like the Mister, that's another temptation. So the question was asked respectfully, but what's the point of original hardware? And I think that that's an excellent question. And my take on this has been that for the past 6 months or so, the rare moment I actually get a chance to play a game, I've actually been playing on Mister. But certain consoles are really important to me. I don't know why. Everybody has those things that they like, but I'll always want to set up with original consoles, and especially the work that I do, I really need original consoles, and especially original unmodified consoles in order to do a lot of these comparisons and show upgrades and stuff like that. So there is no wrong answer at all to this. I'll share my kind of opinion on it, but I just want to be very clear that there is no wrong answer. It's whatever you want to do. But my personal take on this is I've been using the easiest methods possible to play that are as accurate as possible. So Mister through a CRT with a controller adapter, the MacGyver ones that's about a millisecond or less, so 0. That's been an amazing experience, and I have 0 complaints. But I've still been collecting the same amount of consoles, and I don't really collect games too much, only because I have no space for them here. Maybe someday I'll get a chance to, but my hardware collecting hasn't slowed down at all. And in fact, most of the people that I know that have switched to predominantly using FPGA solutions like Analog or Mister haven't sold their collections at all, because it's still an important thing to them. It's still something they like knowing that they own. And there's still that time where, maybe you just get really sucked into using the Mister and you love how it looks on your flat panel. So you go out and pick up a free 13-inch CRT you see on the side of the road, blow it out with some compressed air, set it up, and set your original consoles up in composite video. And then only when you need to, maybe use a scaler you used to own to put it on your flat panel. But you can still have that experience. And there is just something tactile about grabbing your favorite cartridge, using a Q-tip and isopropyl to clean it before using it and not blowing in it, and plugging it in to that console, pushing the switch, grabbing the original controller, hearing that bong when you turn on the CRT, because older CRTs always make those noises. I mean, there's something that's really important to some people, and other people couldn't give a shit about it. And once again, there's no right answer. It's whatever you want. So I completely took your question the right way. Obviously, I've been smiling throughout the whole answer, but I think I would just leave that up to you and to decide how you want to use it, what the best way to use it is. I certainly know a lot of people who just don't have the living room where they could set up a bunch of CRTs, so they just have their analog or Mister hooked up to their flat panel, and in a game room or something they have their original consoles, and just whatever you want to do, really. And my mind changes all the time. Maybe 3 years from now I'm gonna go, you know what, Mister's still the coolest thing on the planet, but I only want to use my original consoles with RF because that's what I'm into now. I don't know. My opinions change all the time, but that's where my head's at now. And the only wrong way to use any of these is by plugging them into a flat panel with a scaler that was designed for VCRs, not video games. Other than that, you're good to go. I'd rather see you plug Composite directly into a flat panel, which is second place for the wrong way to do it. I'd rather see that than a crappy scaler, because at least it's going to be less lag in there. But other than that, you're good to go. Any method that you want to play that you enjoy, including and especially emulation, if you just want to try this stuff out, all of it's a good answer. Alex S. wants to know if my only gripe with modern LCDs deinterlacing 480i signals is the lag. Yes, 100%. Many TVs nowadays have really good deinterlacers in them. And in fact, if you have a game that you're playing that's a turn-by-turn role-playing game or a slow-paced game, I would even consider trying to plug it directly into your panel, or using, like if you have a RetroTINK or OSSC, one of the 2X RetroTINKs, you could put it in pass-through mode so you don't get that jittery bob deinterlacing look on the older ones. Essentially, though, the motion adaptive deinterlacing is going to look pretty much the same with really low lag. Like if you set it to frame lock mode on the RetroTINK 5X, that's 2 milliseconds. That's 0. So now you have pretty much 0 added lag, which is way better than what your average flat panel can. You can go from 1 frame to 4 frames of lag just switching from progressive to interlaced. So I mean, it's a great question, and something that I probably should have done a much better job clarifying when I talk about this stuff. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And I do see a lot of people showing comparisons and stuff like this, and people talking about deinterlacing a lot now that the RetroTINK 5X is out. So I'll try to answer those questions with a little more clarity. But yeah, the only gripe is lag. There's nothing else. You could get a sharper picture with a scaler, but I always make a point to tell people that you don't need a super sharp image in order to have a good experience. You just need to not add a ton of lag when games are fast paced, and you can't treat 240p signals as 480i because it kind of ruins the image. But it's a great question. Hopefully I kind of clarified things. Alan Bingham has one more question. They want to dump all of the ROMs from their NES Classic and SNES Classic onto a USB drive. So per the online instructions, they used HackChi to dump the software, and the next step of the instructions says that it's a zip archive, so they need to unzip it. That's where I'm stuck. I can't find a single program that will unzip that file. I've used 7-zip since it was out, pretty much, and that's always worked. I have never done what you're talking about, but I could just assume that if that really is a compressed archive file, 7-zip will do it, and it's free. So, and I think they have one for every operating system. So I would start there, and if not, I would just ask questions probably in any of the forums that are talking about that as well. But that should be the solution to your problem. A few questions from Jason Guffey. First, they have 2 VCR DVD combo sets, one from Philips, one from Sylvania, and Jason wants to know if there's one that I suggest over the other. If they look nearly identical in design, they're probably the same thing. They're probably made from the same factory, and they just have their different labels stamped on them. But even if they weren't, let's just hypothetically say they were 2 completely different designs, I would choose whichever one worked better. With aging electronics, you could have something that used to be a really high-end thing and something that used to be a mid-grade, and the mid-grade looks and sounds and works better just because maybe it's had less hours of use, maybe it's been stored in a better climate. So, I mean, there's a million things that can go wrong. So I would just, no matter what, always use whichever one works better. Or on the opposite, if you know one, you want to preserve one, use the beat up one until it dies, then save that as a part machine and switch over. But that's pretty much it. Second, they recently got their hands on a fairly high quality VGA monitor and want some suggestions to avoid burn-in. I just wouldn't leave it on 24/7. Even if you have a screensaver, CRTs have a finite lifespan, so I would only turn it on when you're using it. And I make sure to never turn my CRTs off and on. So I'll never power one on, do a 30-second test, power it off, and walk away. Like, I always like to make sure they stay on. I don't know if that's a weird paranoia. I don't know if that's something from my past that I used to have to do on another device that I'm now incorrectly assuming it's that way with the CRT. But that's kind of the only things. Don't leave it on. Don't turn it on unless you're using it. I wouldn't power cycle it a lot unless you had to. And I guess if you're actually using it, the Windows taskbar isn't going to burn in unless you really just leave it for 8 hours a day on that screen. But I don't think there's really much to worry about. Last, where do I recommend they get a new cap kit for the original Xbox? Console 5 is where I get all of my cap kits from. So they're a great source. Luke's a good dude. I keep meaning to go have another podcast with him because it's been a few years and I'd love to just catch up and hang out. So thanks for reminding me. I'll probably try to contact him soon to do that. But I think we got the answer to all three. Matt McGann said, is there something similar to the AshenWorks PSU box, but instead of an RT85, use the MWP606? They recently scored an inexpensive 606 for their house and have been searching for a premium enclosure to keep the cats and kids safe. They grabbed an Ashen unit as well, because why not? I don't know. I don't really know of anybody making cases for these PSUs other than the one I showed in that post. But overall, I mean, I said this in the podcast last week or 2 days ago, whatever. But I also wanted to just reiterate it here, in that I'm not telling people to go buy a bunch of arcade PSUs because money grows on trees and you should be frivolous about this. I just don't know anybody that only owns one arcade board. It's an addiction. Everybody I know that gets one always, at least at some point, gets another one, and that very often multiplies. So if you have multiple arcade boards, everybody knows that arcade boards are finicky and you're sometimes going to have issues. So the number one thing that I always swap out is everything around it. Is the video cable gone bad? Is your power supply gone bad? Is your power cable gone bad? So if you have the MWP606 and you like it, throw that in your closet. Leave it, consider it a tool in your toolbox, and use the AshenWorks one as your main one because it's got that nice enclosure. But if anybody happens to know of an enclosure for that, please post in the comments below, because I always want to keep up on this stuff and know where to point people in the right direction. So I guess that was just a really long excuse of me telling you, you did a good job buying two. I wanted to make sure I was clear about that, because I think sometimes people get really pissed, like, oh, did you hear Bob just telling people to spend all their money again? Like, it doesn't matter. I never mean it that way. I'm always trying to save people money, not make you spend more. But I'd be willing to bet, Matt, that you have more than one arcade board, so having a second PSU is probably going to be just a handy tool for you. Well, that's it for this time. As always, thanks to everybody who participates in these, and if you're new to these, please post your question wherever it is that you support in the latest support post. The way the services work, I can't really skim through old and new questions, and it's also pretty fun just to punch up the latest post and scroll through and read the questions that way. So any question you got for me, fire away, just post it there. And of course, and as always, thank you all for any support at all, because it's what's keeping all of this stuff alive, including the podcast, the behind the scenes research, and interviews, which I'm about to hit stop on this and immediately go to interview a very cool person. So thank you so much for your support, because it's really keeping all of this going.